We going? All right. This is on social structure. And social structure is a concept that's related to culture. We talked about culture in one of the previous videotapes. Culture is the contents of the social structure of a society. The social structure is like how a society is built, with the statuses, which are the positions in a social structure. And the statuses are then accompanied by behaviors that are expected, and those are called roles. So the culture is the total way of life of a group of people, but social structure is the structure, like the container that holds that culture. Like if you think about Coke being the culture, then the glass would be the social structure. And that social structure is made up of patterned ways of behavior, including statuses. Those are positions in a society or a particular social group, and we have multiple statuses. And each one of those statuses then have expected roles. For example, being a father is a status, and how a father is expected to behave is within the expected role. And of course, we're not robots, so we can go outside of that. But today I'd like to use the concept of social structure to explain something very practical that costs taxpayers lots and lots of money. And that's a housing project called Pruitt-Igoe. It's a housing project that started being planned in about 1954 in St. Louis and went for several decades before it was just declared an absolute disaster, and they tore it down. And I'd like to use some sociological concepts because oftentimes architects and city planners don't really use what we know about sociology and people's behavior very well. And lots of things can be avoided when you use that knowledge. Pruitt-Igoe started out, was an old neighborhood. And it was an old neighborhood made up of lots of houses. And this is prior to Pruitt-Igoe. Let me just draw symbolically some of these houses on the block. And this was an old neighborhood that had some prostitution, had some drug addiction, had some crime. It wasn't the safest neighborhood in the world. In fact, it's just southwest of downtown St. Louis. But it was a neighborhood that did have a social structure. And let me show you what I mean by that. Social structure is the patterns of interaction. When you have the people in house A visiting the people over here in house B, that's the beginning of a social structure. There's a friendship there. There's a pattern of interaction. So you get this web of relationships even in the weakest neighborhoods. I worked as a probation officer in Kansas City, Missouri, in the inner city. And in some of the poorest neighborhoods, there were patterns of interactions. There was families helping each other. There were people treated as if they were families helping each other. And you see, this is a web that we don't see, but it holds down the crime rate. It holds down prostitution. It holds down deviance in general. Well, what they did is they came in and said, okay, we've got this neighborhood that we don't like, and part of it was because of tourism. It was too close to downtown St. Louis. They wanted to clean it up and make it look better. So they went in with their bulldozers, kicked all these people out of the housing, and tore down the houses. Well, of course, when you tear down the houses in a neighborhood, you've also torn down the social structure. So this invisible web that held crime down to its moderate level was gone. These people were thrown out in the cold, and they literally went to worse housing. They were thrown out in the cold and wandering around St. Louis, and they went to more substandard housing while all this was being built. And so, you know, they're spending their winters in these houses that don't have insulation or anything of that nature, all in the name of urban renewal. But of course, the intention was good. So they wanted to help these people. What they did within about 2 or 3 years, they were able to construct a new project, called Pruitt-Igoe. It was one of these massive housing projects that held 20,000 people in a series of buildings. So in place of the old neighborhood where you had a few thousand people, all of a sudden now you've got 20,000 people crowded in. Now there are several things that went wrong with this particular project. Number one is putting 20,000 extremely poor people all in just a few block area, you're going to have problems. I mean, here are people looking for a basic way of making a living and so forth. But one of the things that happened was a problem with how they qualified people to get in. To qualify, you had to be extremely poor. So what did that do? That meant you put only extremely poor people in a neighborhood that had a variety of people in it. Now let's introduce an idea. Talked about a role a while ago. Let's talk about an economic role model. So you've got all these people out in the cold for a long period of time. They find housing elsewhere, so they're not coming back necessarily to that neighborhood. You're adding tens of thousands of more people, and you've gotten rid of economic role models. In other words, how do you and I learn how to succeed? We look at other people And we say, my God, if he can do it or she can do it, maybe I can do it. Maybe I can ask them how they did it. Maybe I can hook up with them and they can help me get a job. But if I get rid of all of those role models, I've really changed things quite dramatically. All right? Then, to stay in, and this is what really got perverse, to stay in the project, you had to stay extremely poor. There were no sliding scales at that time. This is one of the things we've learned and done better in public housing since then. You had to be extremely poor. So if you happen to figure out how to succeed, you happen to hook up a good job, then all of a sudden, you're kicked out. So now you don't let economic role models in the first place, and then when they do start succeeding, which in every poor neighborhood some people succeed, you kick them out. So one of the things that they had to change over time was to come up with sliding scales. So you could earn more money, you just paid a little more, but you could stay in the neighborhood. So that kept the social structure from working very well at all. But there's more to it than that as well that involves social structure and a few related items. If you look at how the buildings were constructed, each building was a high-rise that held several thousand people, and they wanted to cut costs. What I'm drawing here are the floors, and on either end of the building were the elevators. Now, by code in normal buildings, the elevator stops on every floor. They got special permission to build this so that this elevator stopped on this floor, and this floor, and this elevator stopped obviously on the first, second, fourth, and sixth floors. Now, what does that do to social structure? Well, when you have people that are directly above you and below you in an apartment house, it's the people around you that make noise that cause problems, and it's the people above you and below you. If you've built an informal social structure, you've gotten to know them, you can tend to solve problems. And the way you often do that in apartments is meeting them by chance in the elevator. But the people directly above you and below you wouldn't ride the same elevator. So if you have problems with the people in the apartment above you, it just makes it less likely you'll know them, less likely to be easy to solve problems. Now, when we look at this idea, this cut down the social structure. Now, if you look at it over time, the crime rate just skyrocketed. The prostitution rate skyrocketed. The crack addiction, at that time it was cocaine and then later crack, skyrocketed. My father-in-law was even shot at. He was a cameraman for KMOX TV. And he was even shot at driving by in the mobile truck one day from an empty building. It got so bad that they realized they had wasted millions of taxpayers' dollars, made lots of people's lives much more miserable than they'd done beforehand, thrown people out in the cold to begin with, and they ended up having to bulldoze the whole thing several decades after they built it and tore it down. Well, if we look at this as an example of social structure and the use of statuses and so forth and what we know about human behavior, the question then becomes, what does work? What does work in public housing and why? Well, about the only thing that really works, and it has its own problems, all human endeavors have problems, is scattered site housing. Now, why would scattered site housing work? Obviously, many neighbors don't like that. They feel it's going to bring down their neighborhood's value, and that's all a very arguable and understandable point. But if we're going to put money into public housing, we have to do what works best. So far, this works best. What's going on here? A scattered site house is built in an existing neighborhood that has an open space in it. And this is like an open block right here, an open lot. Well, what do you already have in an existing neighborhood? Social structure. You've got patterns of interaction, friendships, things that are going to help keep crime down, keep an eye out for friends and other neighbors. If you bring a family into the middle of a block that already has social structure and you build a home there, even when there's animosity and problems, over time, generally people begin to fit in with each other. Over time, this structure develops and friendships develop. Over time, you keep the economic role models in place. So you have people to look up to that you can learn from. You have a sliding scale, so if you make more money, you don't get kicked out of your house. And you have patterns of interaction that keeps crime down, keeps prostitution down, and you don't put an absurd amount, 20,000 extremely poor people in one area. It's almost like a reservation in a way of hiding or holding people as opposed to helping people. So what we know does work is scattered site housing. Now, I'm here to hope and vote that we're going to have scattered site mansions out there on Panther Creek soon. That's a joke. Won't happen. Property value is too high, too much power and prestige, and the people who own there, they wouldn't let it happen. Thank you.